Former minister and founder of Something or Other Publishing, Wade Franson is the host of Created in the Image of God, a series that examines the role of religion in society, from messianic returns to the emotive responses transmitted through our culture. Wade fearlessly addresses reality claims from all directions, objectively exploring their compatibility with Holy Scripture. Joining him is Daniel Sanderson, CEO of Planksiv, an international philosophy and cultural media outlet, helping emerging thought leaders with personal branding by co-creating organic content. Tonight's episode, God, Beyond Our Understanding, with Joseph Atman.
Welcome, Joe. I want to let everybody know that we started the gun there a little quick, and if anybody actually goes back and watches the beginning of the show, they might catch something rather unique and shocking. But now we see that people are starting to come to the party. The door is open. The constituents are coming in to see if there's something profound that we're going to say, something profound that our guest, Joseph Atman, is going to bring. And I want to remind everybody for the second time, right? This is the second time that Joe's been back. And there's part of me that actually hopes that you can actually come back a third and maybe a fourth time. Kind of like a standing quarterly appearance by Joseph Atman. So what I would like to do, Joe, is I'd like to start off by doing a condensed version of the younger version of Joe. In philosophy, we're both philosophers. There's this word called the pre-Socratics. What was the pre-Joseph Atman like? What were you before you grew into the noble being that you are?
Yeah, a great question, and thanks for having me back. I either said something really right or really, really wrong last time to come back and want to explore more of that. So thank you, and I'd love to come back as often as you'll have me. So pre me, I think, and gosh, I could take it and say that before I really figured out what it was that I was kind of called to do with my life and in the world with the organization, the nonprofit that I work at called Middle Tree. I was kind of a floundering human being, just trying to find my way in the world, trying to find what it was that I was supposed to do. And because I think we all, in one way or another, are looking for that calling, looking for what it is that lures us, to keep going in life every day. And I think of myself as certainly more of an academic or a philosopher and a theologian before I am a nonprofit executive. But the latter is what I've been doing, and formerly I did a lot of art. I'm a writer. I'm a musician, and I really focused on that for a while. And while I was kind of in that sort of gestation period of my own becoming, right, I looked very heavily into a lot of the things that we're going to be talking about here this evening, things that I haven't gotten to do so much in my professional life. And that's why I so love coming on here and being able to talk about these kinds of things, because I don't get to encounter them in my day to day. And I think that philosophy is its own kind of art in a way. And so that was what I was really focused on before, is really my own philosophical craft, how I related to those things that I learned about in school for so long. And then, I had worked on doing a lot of writing. I published a few books and a few like shorter pieces. I really love poetry, and so did that. And maybe just because poetry kind of gets right to the point, and it's much easier and shorter to do than a book or a short story for that matter. And love to kind of dabble around, and dink around on the piano. And so I really focused on all of those things, but just thinking that I was going to be, a professor with my professional life. And when that didn't happen as quickly as I had anticipated, I started this other organization that has kind of called Middle Tree, that has led to everything else that I'm currently doing. So.
Well, that's fascinating. I guess the opposite of bristle is what I did when you said creativity and being a professor. So it's the profession of teaching, and that's exciting. I almost wish that that's a that would be a prerequisite for professors and teachers. Is a strong sense of creativity. Um, I think that I think this is our greatest gift is the capacity to be creative, to think in abstract thoughts, um, either deriving proofs from abstractions, but it's an essence. I don't know. Do you spend much time thinking about essence in philosophical thought, or like what would you say the weight of essence is in your work?
The weight of it. So I would say that for me specifically, and this is where I get like real platonic about things, is that the essence for me is basically like the only thing almost. Like everything is just a vanguard for the essence, for the actual being, for the actual happening behind the happening. So for me, though that all comes to many different formations and many different manifests, but it's always about that core essential thing, and which for me is always almost always going to come back to some sort of expression, which is art, right? That's what art is an expression and a capacity for the artist to interact with what he or she perceives as an otherness and digest that, and then kind of in a double reflection spew that out in his or her own way and manifest in a yet another transformative and unique form. So that to me is where creativity, like you said, is so quintessential to who we are as human beings, and discovering not only our own essences, but the essence of whatever it is that we're looking at, right? And then our relationship to it. I think all of those are so incredibly important in our own self discovery and in our discovery about what our relationship to this world and everything else within it actually is.
That's wonderful. So I'm going to bring my little portion to a point, and I think a nice point, a nice bow. I'm going to wrap it up, and I'm going to basically hand the show back to Wade, or over to Wade, at about the 15-minute mark. I want to remind everybody to leave their comments and engage with me, engage with Joseph, and also Wade when he comes on the stage. I want you to engage with them as if you're having the conversation. That's what we're trying to stimulate, is a conversation. So we welcome your comments. We're going to have a few commercial breaks, and in between those commercial breaks, we'll return to this kind of a dialogue. Now, let me kind of lay the groundwork for this nice bow that I tried to explain that I was going to move us towards. So I've got about 8 minutes to do so. And when we look at free will, for example, okay, I think that we're going to pick up and talk a little bit about free will, and we're going to talk a little bit about determinism, and a lot about God. And how do we tie all that together? Now, I would say that when you're looking at something like free will, there's a deterministic standpoint. And I urge the audience to approach this with a little bit of openness, not as a right or wrong position, but there's one particular book from a biologist, primatologist, by the name of Robert Sapolsky, that just dropped this week, I think within this month. And the tradition of a biological perspective on determinism has a lot right with it, but maybe not something that's wholly and complete. So I think something that happens if you're on one side or the other of that equation that you can preemptively dismiss the biological piece. I'm here to say I think they're compatible, and I'd like to get your approach on this, Joe, about how somebody of faith would approach biological knowledge, biological wisdom from, say, leading academics, important thought leaders at universities. Is bristling and abrasion and distancing from that healthy, or how do you approach it when at first it seems like it's I'm going to say antithetical. It just means like it's opposed to what the norm is.
I think first of all, the question is a larger one that it's a old one that has to do with how compatible is religion and science, basically, right? And there are many things that we have to understand about both, and then ultimately it really comes down to our own understanding of our own relationship between both of those things and fields. That being said, to start with, I think we always have to understand that everything is in flux and generally evolving. And I'm not talking about a Darwinianistic approach to evolution or anything like that, but our own understandings evolve, obviously. So, and that's the same of science as well. As we frequently take science, or many do, as the end all be all, the final say, and yet you have on the other side of this folks in a different camp whose faith determines the end all be all, and usually that faith is guided by some kind of religion, belief, something that has been instilled within them. And I think the best thing you can encourage someone to do is to make sure that they are examining their own relationship with both of those things. I think it's good to understand what it is that modern science has to say, with the understanding that science's own comprehension is continually changing, right? And our relationship as human beings to science, this is a whole other conversation, but it is limited given the fact that we're only subjects trying to grapple with objectivity. And that's sort of what science is there to do, is to be that objective stance that gives us a guidepost to objectivity, to understanding that which is other than us. Whereas faith, obviously, and religious beliefs of any kind, really, are frequently more internal North Stars for us. And so how do you meld those two things, or how one goes about that marriage and reconciling those, has got to be something, I think, that needs to be continually examined by the individual. And I would say, and I think a lot of people would disagree with this, that there's no necessarily wrong answer for an individual. If an individual decides how an individual wants to comprehend his or her own relationship to the world, then who are we to tell them that they are wrong? With some exceptions, I think the golden rule is still an important one, right? Do unto others as you'd have done to yourself. Then again, I mean, some people don't think that highly of themselves, I suppose, and have no problem doing harm in the world. So I think you have to understand, again, what your own relationship to the world is and needs to be, and what best suits what it is that you're searching for out of this life, and how that fits into the larger narrative on what is going on within the scientific community. Both of which, again, change probably more frequently than we realize.
Yeah, that's interesting. You put a lot of focus on the individual and that, I guess that individual perspective, or I guess coming to, I don't know what the word would be at that. I guess arriving, but you're not really arriving, but it's
Yeah, because
still a
you're always
personal.
journeying, right?
Yeah, I mean, and I really love that. I love that from a standpoint of the pure computing power of the brain. I mean, if I wanted to stay in a, in a biological nerdy standpoint for a little bit, we're like complete, like the brain is still the most fascinating machine
Sure,
uh, that that we know of, right?
sure.
It's still amazing, and yet we have like, what is it, 8.9 billion of them on the planet now. So taking it one step further, my next question has to do with the congregation of humans under similar, under like a self-replicating pattern, whether it be fractal or which may be some sort of mimesis in shit. There I am going with jargon again. I try not to do that, but it's just
You're
kind of how I
my
think, right?
mimesis,
So
you're mimesis. It's all mimesis.
there we go. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we find commonality naturally. We find commonality, and we congregate in ways that we've been doing for generations and generations. And so I think there's some sort of positive feedback loop that as you find yourself, the surrounding congregating people uh, in the past, and also what you expect to see them do in the future, reinforce this. Is this am I on the right path of trying to explain where you go from the individual into that group synthesis, would you say, as a
I think
philosopher?
so, because who is it that reinforces uh, that thing that you put out into the world, right? It's generally your peer group, whether that's family or just the larger collective of humanity, right? Um, that frequently that's our barometer for what it is, that where we are with our own understanding, I guess. That being said, and here's where I think we fall into the trap frequently, is what gets put out there and what comes back to us. It's not the final determinant, right? The final determinant, in my opinion, has to come from oneself. Otherwise, it's inauthentic. Even if oneself comes to a determination about something that may, if there is such a thing, be ultimately and objectively incorrect, there's still a certain authenticity there that wouldn't otherwise be there if that individual just went along with the herd and went along with the feedback without examining that for his or her own self, and then determining that that was their best particular path or way to go about their own kind of being or understanding
Hmm.
of their, again, to me it comes back to an individual's relationship and contract with the world at large. And I think that it's so important, um, that we need to. It's just so important that we need to continually examine what we think in general, because I don't think that individuals realize what it is that they think. And I don't think we give ourselves enough platforms to externalize our own thought process and to really examine our own minds. And
Hmm.
I think that doesn't happen nearly. To say it doesn't happen nearly enough is an understatement. Where does that really happen? Outside of like a therapy session in the modern era, or unless you're a commentator, a political commentator, right, advocating for something. But advocacy doesn't necessarily mean it's deep intellectualism, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
Where is it that we, and where are we able to examine what we think and who we are on a very true and meaningful level? That's kind of what we're trying to do here in a way, right? Examine our own thoughts and examine again our own relationships to the world at large and to philosophy and religion and all of these things. But where do we give ourselves the platform to really examine who we are and what we think in an unbiased and unscrutinized way? Not that you don't have to look at your thoughts and be critical of them, but where can you just lay out your own thoughts, your own thinking in a way that is not going to be judged, and so that you can just determine and see where you're at as an individual. Check in with yourself, if you will.
Absolutely, Joe. I really applaud you with that, because that's the tradition of Socrates and the dialogue
Right.
and the exchange between. So, wow, what a great place. This is turning out to be a really fascinating conversation. Joe, stay with us. We're going to go to commercial break. I want to remind the audience, everybody listening, to put their comments into the chat. I am not entirely sure. We must be giving another book of yours away, Joe. Did you allow us to give a couple? Like,
Yeah,
we're going to have a stack of your books, and we're going to keep giving your books away. You're not going to be able to make any money with all the books that we're giving away on this show.
Not a lot of philosophers I know got into this business to be rich and famous. So
well,
I think I'm perfectly fine with that.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, so I keep yapping, and I have another story I wanted to say, but I have to hold my tongue. We're going to go to commercial break. We'll be right back. And when we come back in the studio, Wade's going to be in here with Joe. And as always, I might be pulled in at the end. Thanks, Joe.
Thanks, Dan.
In a world where the battle of minds goes unnoticed, one man dared to challenge the very structure of consciousness itself. Joseph Atman proudly presents the first part of his groundbreaking collected work, A Philosophical War. Atman's mission is to expose humanity's most elusive adversary, the structure of its own consciousness. He argues that the modern human condition is plagued by a thought process that inflicts unnecessary suffering. This thought process, like a stealthy enemy, wages war against our nature. Atman's quest is both daring and revolutionary, to overthrow and replace the current prevailing conscious structure. He identifies the enemy within and seeks a more coherent and powerful ally. With digestible bursts of epistemological guerrilla strikes, he pierces the lines of everyday thought patterns. This counteroffensive offers a new perspective, one that challenges the way we perceive reality. Atman asserts that humanity's consciousness has relied too heavily on thought alone. He introduces being with, a relationality that harmonizes humanity with the world around us. But the battle doesn't end there. Atman reinterprets the early chapters of Genesis. He calls for the removal of contemporary notions of God while offering a profound argument for God's existence. Filled with intrigue, simplistic insights, and mystical yet realistic hope, this book is a potential landmark work. A Philosophical War by Joseph Atman. Available at Amazon.
Uh-oh. I got pulled back in early.
We just booted Dan out. He said enough.
Enough of that guy.
But I'm extremely grateful. I'm extremely grateful to Dan for teeing up this just robust and deep conversation. I've been taking notes here, and I could start any one of 6 different directions, but I'm going to dive into something that was actually in that video about your book. And by the way, that book will be given away to the people who are posting interesting comments. So do that. Joe, you talked about in that ad about your book, it talks about the Garden of Eden, right? And it talks about human consciousness being, let's see, what did it say? It said something like, our enemy is the structure of our consciousness. It almost sounds like you're saying that the structure of our consciousness is that serpent in the garden. And in 2 Corinthians 4, verse 4, or 4, verse 3, it says, if our gospel is veiled, it is veiled to those who are perishing, whose minds the God of this age has blinded. Is that what you're talking about when you talk about the structure of consciousness? Is there a parallel there?
So Pearl Jam used to want to not do music videos because it gave, their reasoning behind that was it gave the audience too much of an impression of what the song should be about, right? And
Yep.
as Dan and I just we're talking about, and yes, I mean I could literally talk to Dan for hours, and we do after the show usually. So you know, and in a similar vein, I don't want to tell people exactly what my own interpretations are, but we can kind of tease it out,
Is
and
that
we're
a
here to talk
valid
about it, right?
interpretation? If so, I'm bringing that up because
Yeah,
that's what I got out of it.
right. And
Is
so
that a fair thing to take away
I think
from
in a
it?
word, it's a very fair thing to say, or in a phrase, because the general tenor of that component of the book basically states that yes, if you wanted to read, you know, in that context, that particular story is something of a metaphor, and I'm not here to tell you that it is a metaphor or it's something that evangelically happened as a true physical happening in the world. To me, that part is immaterial, right? But I think one could very well argue, as I more or less have in this book, that that serpent character, whether or not it truly existed or is something of a metaphor, is very much still within our own being or a part of the world
Well, we do
today.
have a reptilian brainstem, do we not?
That we'll
The
have to
fight
ask
and flight
Sapolsky about that.
syndrome.
Yeah,
Right.
but I don't know anything about that stuff as much. But what I do kind of talk about in a philosophical war is that the structure of our own consciousness is the thing that leads to all of the suffering that we basically incur, right? That our relationship, as Dan and I have started to talk about here, I think to me, relationship is the foundation. It's the alpha and the omega of all basic functions within being. Relationship.
Well, and
Everything is a relation. So
yeah, so jumping back to that metaphor, that story, that Garden of Eden, the quote is something like, Eve looked at the fruit and and she could see that it was desired to make one wise. And in Buddhism, our desires are the source of all pain and suffering, right?
mhm.
And then later it says, after that all happened, that her desire would be to her husband and he would rule over her. So absolutely, our desires were awakened according to that story, and those things that we want sometimes entrap us, right?
Absolutely. Um,
And so getting to the structure of consciousness then, and having read most of your book, I had to take a pause because of getting way too busy, and there's a lot in it, so I like to take it slow and fully digest it. But you do get into how, in very specific ways, how our concepts, how we structure our understanding and our approach to the world, um, are flawed, and then we're trapped within them, as one might be in a house of mirrors, unable to engage with the reality because it's just causing us to misinterpret what we're experiencing, right? And
that's exactly correct. Yeah. I mean, so basically, a person's concepts, very simply put, ideas are not necessarily realities because the ideas that we have come to us as subjects trying to, and again, here it is, trying to determine or interpret the relationship that we have with the world
right,
or with a reality itself, whatever it
right.
might be, right? So our own
Exactly,
individual.
and thank you for bringing that back into relationship, because
Yeah.
where I was really going with digging into the Garden of Eden metaphor was the immediate result of that, according to the story, was that Adam and Eve realized they were naked, and then they hid from God,
Mhm.
right? They chose to sever the relationship. The relationship was disturbed, and they hid themselves.
Yeah, because they had an idea, right? So everything stems from our own capacity to digest what it is that's happening in the world, and that formulates our consciousness. And or you could make the case that what our consciousness is capable of processing formulates the reality. And I would later argue that the two are actually indistinguishable. But yes, basically, Adam and Eve have this concept about their relationship to God, right? And they decided to, first of all, the first thing they did was put a physical barrier between themselves and the natural world. They realized that they were naked, they felt shame, put a physical barrier between themselves and the world. And so that said that not only were they not really a part of this world, but that they needed some sort of protection from it, not only from it as a physical entity, but from their own concepts themselves, right? Their own shame. They needed to do something about this new found feeling, this new idea that they had. And so going back to that initial question that you had about where does the serpent kind of live within our consciousness, that the serpent is part of our actual consciousness. And that's what, not to say that mankind's consciousness is evil or anything like that, but that because of our relationship to conception itself, because of our relationship to ideas, because of how we process things, because of the way that we take ideas as though they were realities, that's where we become removed from that otherwise very, very fluid and perfect relationship, unhindered relationship that we would otherwise have, not only with the world at large, but with a deity and maybe even most importantly, our own selves.
So now in my personal understanding or awareness of the story of the Bible, if you fast forward to the end, that serpent grows up through its whispering ability to influence people individually and then en masse.
Mm-hmm.
There's a term that's thrown around today, mass formation psychosis, right? And when that serpent influences enough people who join forces politically, then it becomes a dragon, right? In the book of Revelation, that serpent is now a dragon. And this is literally explained that, that old serpent, the dragon, that old serpent, right? So now in our day, you talked about science and religion. So this is another thread I want to weave here. And that is that it is my view that the revealed word is critically important. It does form that North Star for many, many people who would follow the words of the Bible and other holy writings. And yet, to your point, our constructs, our conceptions, our preconceived notions, and the way in which others explain it to us, right? It's all flawed. And so as we target the North Star, we're way off course. If you just take the moon as an example of the North Star and you're trying to get there, but if you're off by a few degrees, you're just going to go flying into outer darkness. So none of us have it dialed. None of us have it understood. The religions clearly don't have it dialed or understood, because look at what many of the followers and adherents of those religions have done throughout history and are doing, right? So that doesn't, in my opinion, diminish those holy writings. But there's a bigger revelation, and that is the creation itself, which I believe comes from the same author as the holy writings. And science is the study of that book, right? And it is my opinion we're only beginning to learn the language of knowing how to read that book. We've been groping for millennia to understand it. You can look at the ancients, how they tried to understand the stars, and there's the Copernican revolution, right? And we've slowly begun to grasp to a better degree the world in which we live and how it works and how it functions. But science is today in its infancy. But those twin things of the personal experience that we have with the written word that I would believe comes from God. And then that outer manifestation, the physical world, helps us determine how far off we are in our course towards the moon, right? They become a dual objectivity, our own internal experience, and our fantasy, if you will, as to how the world works, which might be built on concepts or hopes or dreams. And then the harsh reality of, we wake up from our dream in which we think we can fly, and we hit the floor as we roll out of bed because gravity is still in effect, right? The physical world around us is a reality check. And this is one way that I like to look at the idea of science and religion. So in your work, as you begin to get at concepts, what would you say to that in terms of helping people do what you're calling for, which is realizing what they think? Individuals don't realize what they think, is something you said earlier. And the structure of consciousness itself is the problem if that whispering serpent is in there messing with us, right? So this internal targeting of the North Star, and then the real world around us that confronts us with reality. What would you say to all that?
So I think that, there's so much there, as always. But I think that this is kind of going back to what Dan and I were sort of talking about before, is this is frequently the importance of art and of expression itself, because where is your platform for discovering who and what you are and what your relationship is? And this is where I said I've always thought of philosophy as its own kind of art. So where do you allow yourself in an unfettered capacity to make your own discoveries about what it is that your own personal contract with the universe looks like, in an unbiased way, in a way that you can totally express yourself without fearing the judgment from your peer group or your religion or your mother or whomever it might be, right? Your spouse. This is where you need to discover what it is that allows you to not only be yourself, because that's very cliche, but it's very relevant. But what is the platform that you're able to participate in that allows you to make a discovery about your relationship to the world and about your own thoughts? Because I think that you'd be surprised if you, and I've done, this is how I got into philosophy in the first place. So I used to take one of those old dictaphones that had little mini cassettes in them when I was a kid, and I'd press record and start talking about stuff. And anybody who knows me, or if you've been watching the show for the past half an hour, you can tell that I don't mind talking about stuff. But I think you'd be really, really surprised, as I found out at a very young age, about what you think if you allow yourself to just talk out loud, think out loud, and put yourself on record and figure out whatever it might be. A lot of people might think that they know where they stand politically or religiously, or what they think about the people they love the most. This is where therapy is so important. This is where art is so important. And I'm not advocating that everybody needs to go see a therapist or anything like that, but I'm gonna that allows you that discovery.
Yeah, let me jump in here and concretize it in another way. So let's take another model, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? At the top, you have self-actualization. And what's coming to my mind as you talk is the freedom to manifest who you are, right? And woe unto him who has that freedom, right? That's, it's the Spider-Man conundrum, right? Oh. With great power comes great responsibility. So we're increasingly in modern society having more and more freedom. Certainly in the last, since the Enlightenment, we've been more empowered and more free. Who was it? Was it Dan or you that said there are now 1 billion brain or 8 billion brains? more, a larger number than ever before in human history are able to self-actualize and manifest with a lot of power, the power that used to only be granted to kings, right? To manifest themselves and their inner world and their inner thoughts and fantasies. And that's both a blessing and a curse, but ultimately it's a blessing, because we don't realize how we think, as you said. Two things come to mind from the Bible. One is Matthew chapter 7, and the whole book of Matthew is really about judgment. And one of the central concepts of the book of Matthew is, by whatever standard you use to judge, that's how you're going to be judged. And if you have the power to express yourself, your hypocrisy will be revealed, right? It's been revealed every day, millions of times over on the internet, right? As people were empowered to express what they think and feel and given some kind of anonymity, and to your point, a platform to express themselves. And our inner hypocrisies are revealed if we can see it. And at the same time, however, Jesus also said, let him who is without sin cast the first stone. So we should not be in the business of judging each other, even as we are given the power to manifest who we are, for better or worse. But each of us is on our own individual journey, and each of us has the responsibility to self-actualize according to Maslow, but now in this way, right? To recognize themselves in the mirror, to recognize what they think and feel, to manifest it, and objectively be able to look at it and say, oh, I didn't realize that about myself.
Yeah. And again, where do you allow yourself that discovery? A lot of people, and I think, to kind of turn it back, a lot of people find that they're very empowered by latching on to something. But yet and that something could be anything. They can be a fan of a sport. It can be, a part of an organization. It can be a particular idea. They feel very empowered by that. But then the devil in those details would be that, is that empowerment the allurement, or is that really helping you define your own self? Is that really a discovery about you, or are you just latching on to something else, and that makes you feel great about your own capacity to have this navigational path within the world itself? And a lot of people, again, they really, really feel that, and I think that this is where it gets tricky, is because that's an obvious pitfall. And yet when you're dealing with something like faith, with something like religious aspirations, or that desire to understand and know something about a God, or about, that higher source of the universe, of being, of consciousness, that in and of itself, I think is the highest endeavor that a person could seek out. And it can be very empowering, but then the trappings there are, you have to discover, and that's the ultimate relationship, I would argue, and that's the ultimate pathway towards finding who it is that you are. But the trapping there is, you still have to come to that determination, and that relationship has to be your own, because it doesn't mean anything if that relationship, whether that's with yourself, your spouse, you with yourself, you with your spouse, you with your dog, you with your God, that doesn't mean anything unless it's authentically yours, in whatever way that looks like, and needs to play out for you. And how it plays out, it doesn't mean that whatever it is right now, that's the final piece. That's the beauty of it, is it evolves, and it continues, and it continues to be, and continues to become. There's no stasis there. There's no death. There's only evolution, and only something that continues to bring you greater understanding. But you have to be able and be willing to seek it out, and to have that dialogue, and to not get trapped in so many of those very easy things to fall into within life and in the world. And so where are you able to do that? And where are you able to do that freely?
Wow. So much to think about. And there have been so many great comments in the chat.
No.
I'm just going to share one here publicly that I'm sure you'll agree with here from L4YL4, or is that?
I always forget that I'm always in full screen and forget that we can.
And that's great. And that's great because I don't necessarily want to derail it with the chat, but because we can come back to it.
Sure.
But I'm sure you'd agree with this one, right? Observation without judgment is key.
Well, there is no true observation if you're judging things. I mean, I think that that's relatively obvious, and yet that is frequently, I mean, almost, that's kind of the point of a philosophical war, as you know, Wade, right? That you can't obtain reality unless you remove your own concepts, so your own ideas, your own biases, even your own experiences, as much as you can do that. If you have direct observation of a thing, then you are truly and really with that thing. And there is no Wade Franson, there is no Joe Atman anymore. That it's just the observation, and that's all. And that's kind of insane if you think about it. But if as soon as you put yourself into that, and that's fine. That we have individualism for a reason. I mean, there are individual beings that form a collective. I think that, whatever put this whole structure of phenomena together knew what it was doing. Or maybe it didn't, and it's just discovering itself along the way. I don't know. But I think that it's...
Or maybe both.
Or maybe both, right? Or maybe both. And how amazing would that be? And that's probably what it is, because it's usually a both and, I think. But again, if you're able to remove all of your judgment, then you're able to see clearly. And that's what science, to again bring it back, that's what science purports that it is doing. Although I think if we were to examine it quite a bit further, or maybe not even so much further, you'd see that some of the most bias occurs within the scientific or the academic community, because there's a narrative there that needs to continue on. And we kind of talked about this last time, I think. I know we've talked.
Yeah, well, one quick comment before we go to commercial break, but Gary Larson in The Far Side, wasn't he brilliant at pointing at that out, with the men in their lab coats in the laboratory squabbling over some petty little personalized detail, right? Scientists are human too. And big science is funded by money, and we all know what money does. There's a joke, they told me follow the science and I couldn't find it. So I followed the money and then I found science, right? There's a lot of truth to that, right? And not to rag on science. It's just that we're just people, and people everywhere have the same issues and problems. And
and you're totally right. Behind all of this is still a very human happening, right? And that's part of the point, is that with that humanity comes ideas about things, comes our own interpretations of what the world is, and what our relationship to that world actually is and should be. And from that, we're not quite able to observe as effectively as maybe we think that we are. And we think that we have this access to an objectivity that maybe cannot be really unveiled in the way that we hope and think that it is, because of the limitations of our own subjectivity. And then you can translate that to any number of things that you observe or interact with within the world. It's just who we are. But I think that it's important simply to recognize that. And then from there, you're free once you recognize it, you're free to act from there. But you have to observe it. And you have to observe it without those biases and those concepts and those ideas.
So I'm gonna wrap up this segment with just my own sort of comment in the context of me as the host of a show called Created in the Image of God, the role of religion in society, and a pre-announcement for the Inside Crowd. We're going to be changing that tagline from the role of religion in society to I'm having a brain freeze what we're changing it to. It'll come back to me in a second. But anyway, because of the title of the show, I'm going to sort of put a wrap around this segment as we move into the commercial break. And that is to say that we've been talking a lot about the personal, right? And we've been actually emphasizing how religion's role in society must be to inspire and not to coerce, right? The minute you get dogma, the minute you get people telling you what you should think, what you should believe, and how you should view the world, right? You've poisoned it, and it's destined to evolve in a bad way, or to devolve, right? And so that's just sort of an overlay comment here, where we on the show are advocates of religion, but in the sense of searching and seeking and not believing you have arrived and that you have all the answers. Because the minute you think you have the answer, you've just guaranteed that you can't learn.
Yeah, and I think that we're all so anxious to know the answer, and there's nothing wrong with that. There isn't. We're so curious, and we're so innocent in so many ways that we just want to know. And why do we want? I mean, ask yourself, why do you want to know? Well, you want to have an understanding. Well, why? Well, you want to have a comprehension of the way things work, so that you can better assimilate to that thing. Well, why? It never ends. And that's just the point, is it never ends. So it's cliche to say, it's the journey, not the destination. But we need to understand that who we are is this happening, this conglomerance of so many ideas, so many influences, that to seek out what we think of as an arrival, as an understanding, it's really a kind of death, right? It really is. It really stops that process of being alive and evolving and becoming, and so it's kind of inverted. To have ultimate understanding, that's the end of it. So why would you want that? And that's where I think the whole concept of being itself,
kind of like, hey, no, shut up, don't spoil the movie, right?
Yeah, right. I mean, exactly, though, right? But that's where I think, if being has divided itself into so many different consciousnesses, that's where that movie continues, right? That story continues. There's no ending, because what's after that? Well, stagnation, death, nothing. And nothing can't really be, by definition. There is no. I mean, there's only existence. There's no such thing.
Well,
you're proof of that, right?
So I want to move in the next segment, right after this break, away from the philosophical, the personal, the interpretive, and more towards that manifestation, not just of my personal, self-actualization. Certainly there's that, but in my goal, my effort to try to accomplish something, because you're the founder of Middle Tree, right? And Middle Tree is an organization that's focused on education, and we're cooperating, we're collaborating. I've launched Royal Falcon Foundation, and I've gotten some funding from some other organizations and sponsors. And a couple of people from your organization are actually coming down to a retreat that we have in Arizona. I'm actually flying out tomorrow, because we're looking at this overall topic of experiential education, and in your world, tailored education tailored to the individual, with an individual learning plan. So I want to talk, when we come back, about this concept. It's actually, I heard it's probably not totally new, but I've heard it as expressed in the Baha'i faith, that work is worship, right? And in that sense, however we choose to manifest that internal goal through our life's work, or whatever work we happen to be doing it might not be our life's work, it's the work, the project we're currently working on. But there is, to your point, there's something authentic about it when we put ourselves in it, when we approach it as worship. And so when we come back, I want to talk about what you're doing with Middle Tree, and what we're doing, and why, and what the educational philosophy is behind that, and how you hope, to accomplish something from that. And that's a segue into this particular ad, which is, from and about the Royal Falcon Foundation. So to the audience, stay tuned. And those of you who are having just this fascinating conversation in the chat, we'll get back to you in a little bit when we come back after this commercial break. Stay tuned. We'll be back with more of Joe Atman, philosopher, founder of Middle Tree.
In a world where the battle of minds goes unnoticed, one man dared to challenge the very structure.
Welcome to the Royal Falcon Foundation. Our curriculum and activities inspire and train adolescents through hands-on experiences, fostering growth and empowerment. Through immersive and challenging experiences, we shape young minds to think independently and develop their leadership skills. Our programs foster new friendships and unity, shaping young leaders to tackle real-world challenges with confidence. We believe in equipping the next generation with the skills to become leaders of tomorrow. Join us at the Royal Falcon Foundation and be part of a journey that empowers, unites, and inspires. Visit our website and embrace a world of possibilities today. RoyalFalconFoundation.com.
Welcome back. We're in the studio with Joe Atman, founder of Middle Tree, author of A Philosophical War. And coming off that ad about the Royal Falcon Foundation, we're just moving into a segment on the application of that internal discovery in terms of making a difference in the world and manifesting some form of vision, some form of change. So Joe, tell us a little bit about Middle Tree, what's behind it, how you arrived at it, and what you hope to accomplish with it. I know that's many mouthfuls, but
yeah, no, I'll
start wherever you want.
For once in my life, try and be brief. Middle Tree is an organization created and run by educators. The point of our mission, and we're a nonprofit 501c3 charitable organization, and as I always emphasize, we are a mission, and that mission is fundamentally to change the way people are able to engage and experience their own education, to change their own relationship with their own consciousness, with their own education. And so the point of our mission, or the way that we go about, doing that particular aim, is we want to make sure that this is something that's affordable for everybody. We do a lot of tutoring, test preparation, counseling, enrichment activities, things that schools don't always necessarily have the time to do. We kind of come in and supplement. So we work with a lot of school districts, cities, housing developments, boys and girls clubs, basically anybody who needs educational programs. We come in and help out with those things. But the point of this is to make sure that this is affordable for anybody who wants it, to make sure that we are individualizing the particular path and plan with every student that we're working with. And then we have a program kind of at the heart of what we do that allows for students to work in an unlimited capacity. So they have as much time as they want or need to work with us. Kind of works like going to a gym, where you go to a gym, you sign up for the gym, you can go whenever you want to, stay for as long as you need to. You want to work on legs one day and arms the next day, whatever it is that you want to do, you can do while you're at the gym. And same thing with us, except with us, we give you a personal trainer while you're doing it. So we're personalizing that path and plan. We're giving you as much time as you need to do it. And then we're making sure that everyone has access to it, regardless of their financial capacity. And by that, what we're trying to do is we're trying to, again, change what people expect from their own education. The school systems right now, they're not able to give people whatever time they want to understand a concept, to understand an idea, right? That class is over, the semester's over, the school year's over, it's over. And then, of course, they give you one lesson, right? For one lesson for everybody. Not everybody learns the same way. Many people are embarrassed to ask questions. You have to you either understand it or you don't. D for diploma, on to the next thing, right? And so that's really not the way we learn. And so again, we're trying to go back to the original nature by which, and the very simplistic happening of the way that people learn. It's a very simple idea.
So
to my knowledge, nobody's doing it.
So we chose to enroll our children in the Montessori school program. For those who don't know, Maria Montessori, Italian doctor, or I'm trying to remember exactly what her background was, educator. She had this idea of follow the child, and she studied children. She studied how they learned. And then she tried to create an educational program. One of the statements is follow the child, right? To understand how the child learns, what the child is interested in, pick up on what the child's natural curiosity, and to ride that and leverage that versus viewing the child as the problem that needed to be sat down and talked at, right?
Right.
And she also was really, I think, brilliant in the way that she integrated certain things that the parents needed and the home needed into the school environment. So there were a whole lot of practical things that were being learned by young children that would help them function more holistically in the home. And so there was no homework in her program because the kids were helping the family out, and that was the homework. Some of the lessons that it was experiential learning in that way. So how would you say what you're doing compares to or contrasts or builds off of or leverages any of that? And were you aware of that, and does that play into it at all?
I'm mildly aware of what Montessori does, right? We haven't modeled anything per se off of that, but definitely aware of some of those happenings within there. I'd say that the closest thing that we do that parallels that is we don't necessarily just say, okay, our 6th graders learn this, our 7th graders learn that, or whatever. It's where are you at, right? With Montessori, they don't, they're frequently have students lumped together by capacity rather than age.
They have typically like 1st, 2nd, and 3rd grade in one classroom, 4th, 5th, and 6th grade in one classroom. Yeah. There's a lot of flexibility there. They also start with them really young. Our daughter started when she was 3. Our son started when he was 18 months. I assume you don't have that aspect, right?
We do TK, but yeah, we don't start with them, at 18 months per se. Yeah, that's pretty amazing. I don't think I did realize that, to be honest with you. But,
yeah, it was great because, and that's part of the. So let's talk money for a moment. And I was on the board of the Montessori school. That's why I know as much of it as I do. It works because at that point in time, you need some kind of childcare. And we had our daughter in something called Imagination Station, which in reality was anything but. And when our daughter got like written up by the daycare people because of some interaction, and we were scolded that we needed to socialize our child at home. And I said, but she's an only child. We only have one child. Who's she supposed to be socialized with? In fact, that's why we put her in your program. So the point is, you don't have free alternatives, and you gotta, if you're both working or whatever, you need childcare. So the value proposition of the Montessori school was like off the charts in terms of the comparative cost of Imagination Station versus a Montessori school, and the comparative value. There was no comparison. So that's a huge selling point economically, because as you said, you don't want to turn away people based on cost, right? But somehow it all does have to be paid for. So you have to work with the economic reality as well.
Yeah, and for so many people, it's that economic barrier that hinders them. And of course, for everything, right? But in education, especially, if you have the capacity to send your student to private school, well, why do they say, well, private school, is so much better than public school? Well, they're paying, a huge tuition at a very, for young, grades, for young children. And generally speaking, they're able to outbid public school teachers. They're able to pay them more. They're able to have smaller class sizes. They're able to
certainly some private schools are able to do that, but actually, I don't think that's an accurate description of, if you took, the entire footprint of private schools. I think each school in a public school world gets a significant amount of money per child compared to many private schools. You follow me? Because so
but it's what they do with that money.
There you go. Right. It's also an aspect of what the money is spent on and how the money is deployed and used.
Right, exactly. Where the parents, because they're funding it, have a greater say-so in what's happening. Right. So that's what it is. Yeah, because of course Middle Tree is really subsidized by school by the relationships that we have with school districts and entities that have a funnel and channel to government money, right? And so the government puts in literally, especially in the state of California where we operate primarily, billions of dollars into individual programs that fund supplemental services like the ones we provide. So
Right.
so yeah, there's a ton of money out there, but the governor and the education secretary are setting up, along with many other people, what the parameters, how those funds need to be used. Where I think private schools, there's a lot more leeway, a lot more play, a lot more, and that's kind of the great thing about having this dialogue about what education should be, about what students should be getting, rather than handing something over, unfortunately, to a state-run system. Listen, I think public schools do a phenomenal job with their with what they have. And you get into a whole other conversation about some of the pitfalls of school itself. And I don't think that the public school system, is a bad system. I think it's rather miraculous that it's able to function in the way that it is. And it's getting better all the time. I mean, people have a lot of criticisms of public school, rightfully so in some regards, but these are people who, teachers, educators. I think I'm biased, but I think they're special people, in totality, and they're doing good work, but they're frequently handcuffed by so many difficult situations that are not of their own making.
Well, and so let's get back into the reason for getting into that field. So you're obviously working with tailored individual programs, and it's supplemental, but you're hoping to accomplish something. And obviously, you're wanting to improve the quality of that child's educational experience and the benefit of that educational experience to them. How does some of the things we were talking about in the first section around the mental models, the concepts that are flawed, that entrap us, and the need to have some ability to reflect on ourselves and take control of our own destiny, for lack of a better soundbite. How does some of that play in to what you do with these individualized educational programs?
Yeah.
Or does it? Are you able to in the context of that initiative?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I frequently say that I wouldn't have been able to found Middle Tree in the way that we in the past and currently operate if I didn't have the background that I did educationally. And yet we are kind of sort of in a bit of a revolt from the traditional academic sort of processes. So what we do here is so related to what we were talking about before, so far as that relationship is concerned, with what it is what the world's narrative might be versus your own experience with your own mind, with your own consciousness. School is actually the primary example of this. You are taught a very particular and a very certain thing, and if you don't regurgitate that lesson back out in the exact way that it was told to you, you are literally considered a failure, right? So the system, and I'm not saying
you are literally judged.
You are literally judged and considered not worthy. And
Right.
So this is not a criticism of the public school system. This isn't a criticism of the private school system. This is a criticism of systemization itself. So when you have a system that runs, what's the point of a system? The point of a system is to obtain a particular end. It's to obtain a goal. This is great if you are baking a cake, you got a recipe. If you're building a bridge, you got blueprints. If I'm trying to drive from here to downtown, I navigate a road, a highway system. If I'm trying to score points in a basketball game, I hear the triangle offense is a great way to go. However, I would say, and I would argue quite contentiously, that a system is a terrible way to educate an individual. And that is because systems are built for the masses. Systems are built to make sure that particular result, which needs to be obtained, can be obtained regardless of the user, right? So that's why you don't remember anything that you were taught in your high school biology class. You don't remember who the second president of the United States is. You're not exactly sure what the cell membrane of in biology or of a plant really does. Because when you learn something in our system, in our education system, that system doesn't care whether you really learn it or not. It wants you to remember something about it, regurgitate that information, then you can do whatever you want with it. Normally what we do is just forget about it because it's just a system that it's pulling us through. And that system just wants you to obtain the end. The end for our school system is to graduate and to be done with the system, where it should be the other way around. In any good system, in my opinion, in any good system that's worth its salt, any good system should be actively engaged in working to make itself irrelevant, where the school system is trying to make itself more and more and more and more relevant.
It serves itself. Right. So there's a point in your book, and I'm so fascinated by this. I'm looking at the time and I'm realizing, okay, I got to move on. But there's a part in your book where it's one of my favorite. I forget what it's called in the back, the epistemological bursts of epistemological energy in guerrilla strike format or whatever. But it was one of my favorite one of those in which you talk about how we create a construct. That construct creates some value. That idea, that thing creates some value. And now we're invested in it. These are my words. Now we're invested in it, and we have to keep feeding it in order to retain the power that we got by having created something of value. And that's when we create a system around it in order to protect ourselves from losing the thing that we have. And then, more people get involved, and now the thing has to be fed. You've created a monster that has to be fed. And the next thing you know, you're invested in defending this thing that has become a monster.
Yeah. And
you're trapped by it, and you got to keep doing it. And I've also written a trilogy, and in my second book here, The Hardness of the Heart, I come at that same problem from a different angle, in which I was in a spiritual dead end for 10 years. I was trapped by my own construct of how I had conceived my purpose and my role and my relationship with God. And it wasn't working, but I was invested in it, and I had to keep feeding it. And it took me literally like 10 years to do what you say. I don't think individuals realize what they think. And I couldn't see it. Probably a lot of people around me could see, kind of what it was, right? But nobody could explain it to me in a way that I could grasp it internally, right? So I would assume that what you're doing is you're helping people to be able to take control of their own educational experience in such a way that they are a little bit more detached from it, and able to, and this is part of the Montessori educational program as well. Rather than driving the joy of learning out of people, you're instilling the joy of learning into people, so that it's not the system doing it at all, but it's internally self-motivated, and it's a constant search for discovery and an openness to engage and experience and observe, as you've talked about earlier.
Learning should be really fun. We know this as adults. It's fascinating to watch that documentary or to read that book or to observe something and come away from that observation saying, I had no idea. But we impress it on our students as something that has to be done, like eat your vegetables. It's almost like we're like, hey, kids, you better eat this ice cream right now. And it's like, I don't want to eat the ice cream right now, because you make them do it all the time, right? Where you should love ice cream. You should love, the sweets. You should love, like, it's like we've inverted it. Like we make it so undesirable. And so such a happening that people are actually turned off by learning.
Well, we're gonna forego the planned commercial break because we've gone over time, and we need to bring Dan back in before we let him escape from where he's been hiding in the back of the studio, and see what his thoughts are. So I'm gonna drag Dan back in here and let him spend a couple of minutes sharing any observation that he has and asking any questions of you that he's been waiting for a chance to ask.
Well, guys, I've really I've enjoyed it. I've enjoyed the conversation. I think like it reminds me of an optimal learning space with small groups, like one teacher and a few students to. I mean, we do this later on in post-secondary. By the time you get to later level masters or Ph.D. Levels, you have that opportunity to do that one-on-one learning, coaching, brainstorming. You know, my supervisor he's a supervisor at that point. He's not, you know, I mean, at that point, like, you know, it's almost hands off with teaching. It's let me see if I can kind of steer you in that right direction. And the young mind is so brilliant that approaching young learning minds with a similar type of approach, I think could be very rewarding for both student and teacher. So I think that's really interesting. What it may mean is that I hear a bunch of things, and I think in the journey of being able to become closer friends with Wade, and I think some of the views that Wade has, I'm not trying to pin Wade down here at all, but he's shone some light on some superstructures in society. They may be educational, they may be governmental, but they have equity and mass of their own that self-perpetuates more and more mass, because they've established something good, and they want more and they want more. But it also anchors it down and builds its own form of dogma. And that's something that I think maybe one of the lessons that I'm hearing from you, Joe, is that the same sort of thing can happen at small group levels with teaching classes. That I really like this idea of the goal, if there is a goal of the learning, is to kind of fade itself out of existence. That's quite remarkable to imagine. We had government structures that tried to do something similar, and then reform, and then reform, and then build up, and then reform. Like, we have this increasing information, like flow of information. We're receiving information at an accelerated rate, but our institutions are not keeping up with that ability to tap into the constellation of marvel that happens between each and every citizen's ears, right? And we're also quick to throw our brothers, our friends, our family under the bus, to discount their views, ridicule them, and say that ours is better, I'm smarter than you. You know, it just seems such a like a kind of a silly thing to do. I was wondering what both of you guys think about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a totally futile effort to do those kinds of things, because like what we were saying before, when you're saying that my way is the way, then there's nowhere else to go, right? Which is absurd, because that means that you're just committing suicide on a virtual level there. That you're saying this is it, this is all that it is. There's no other interpretation. That's what it is, and that's stagnant, and that's dead. And then so that to me it's not obvious necessarily, given the way we've set up our own ideas about these kinds of things, but it becomes very obvious when you look at it for what it is. And so far as the institutions are concerned, yeah, isn't that the point? I mean, why are all these institutions so archaic so outdated, so arcane. It's because they keep holding on to what they are as an institution, but they don't keep up with who human beings are. That was sort of.
Well, is that also because of the speed, the accelerated speed of change and discovery, enabled also, of course, by technology. But of those 7.8 billion minds that exist today that have been largely educated in ways that was not the case in history, and with more access to experiences and perspectives, are we as a species evolving in that sense, a loose use of the term evolution, in ways that are accelerating beyond the capacity of our institutions to keep up and manage?
I would say that that's always been the case, that we've always outpaced, humanity has always outpaced its institutions, because and I don't know, maybe not always. I mean, but I think on individual levels, you grow more quickly than an institution is able to keep up with, for sure. On a humanitarian level, I think that frequently the institutions keep humanity in check. So that it's always the case that the individual and the humanity at large can far outpace, I mean, cheetah to tortoise speed, by which it can outpace the institution. Because by the time the institution gets set up and concretized and codified and all that stuff, we're already done with it, right? The need that we had for it when we thought we were establishing it has now changed, because again, here it comes full circle. Our relationship to the world and to what's beyond us has changed. Our understanding has changed. The institution is there to sort of, again, memorialize that understanding. But when that understanding continues to change, if the institution doesn't change along with it, then what have you got? You've got an institution that's there to protect and serve up the powers of those who are involved in it to an extent, rather than serving the larger humanity that it was initially well-intended, most likely, put up to serve. But this is where, like you mentioned, technology. This is where technology is so great. I mean, this is where your smartphone is so amazing. I mean, your smartphone, the genius of that is, my smartphone looks totally different than your smartphone. Might be the same brand. Might be what do you plug into it? What apps do you have? How do you use it? Right. The genius of it is the sort of homogenized happening that is particularized based on how you want to use it, what you want to download onto it, how you want to interact with it. That's what an institution should be. Kind of like what Dan was saying about when you get to post-secondary ed, you've got a mentor who's there to steer and guide you, but it's not there to dictate to you what you should be doing.
But so I don't disagree with anything you're saying as a part of reality, right? But the reality behind the smartphone is that this is possible because of the existence of all kinds of institutions over the last 1,000 years, without which we wouldn't have the smartphone, and without which their ongoing existence, and that, for better or worse, includes their power, right?
Whether institutions are necessary. That's they're necessary, but then they necessarily need to be discarded after a while or evolve to keep it relevant. I mean, this is the law of fill in the blank. Everything, right? Like you have to keep changing. You have to keep.
Within the marketplace, we have this thing called creative destruction, right? In terms of businesses, right? Disruptive business models, right? But those are disruptive systems within the system of systems, right? They're not disrupting the overall institution. When the highest order of institutions experience not evolution but revolution, right? The French Revolution. You follow me? Then structure of civilization begins to crumble. We had the Dark Ages, which was, perhaps that was more because of institutional overreach and the fact that an institution had too much power and continued. But I guess, Dan, to throw it your way, the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths and the barbarians at the gate. Is what I'm getting at. So there's some kind of balance here, is what I'm saying.
The Visigoths, yeah. Well, then, we're prophetically. I mean, I don't know if you're going there with this, but prophetically, just saying the fall of Rome is inevitable, and we're going to be.
It is inevitable, sadly, right? In terms of how it falls and when it falls versus us figuring out a way to advance the evolution peacefully without causing misery and death and destruction.
Mm.
What must be preserved as we transition from institution to institution?
But I would
The
argue,
sanctity of human life.
that
right?
what's behind the institution, isn't it a concept? Isn't it an idea about how things should be? Isn't that ultimately?
Absolutely.
So what are we? So
Absolutely.
why even focus necessarily on the or say that the institution is the heart of it? Because look at, you talk about the fall or destruction of society, or what? Why is it that society keeps doing this to itself? Well, isn't it because it keeps holding on to the same ideas? Because it keeps thinking the same things of itself? Because it keeps interacting with itself in the same way, just in a different form? So what's the heart of the matter here? What's, again, to bring it way back to the beginning of what's the essence? And shouldn't that be the focus? Shouldn't the essence of the thing be what we're actually trying to drive at? And if we can't change the essence, then the forms are just they might look different, but you're gonna get the same outcome every time. And I think you can make the argument that throughout human history, at least in its current incarnation and inception that we are aware of, that the same story keeps playing out in a variety of different forms.
Oh, I agree. I agree with you that it's, the definition of madness, right? Doing the same thing, expecting a different result, but at a scale writ large, right? Which is the rise and fall of civilizations.
Yeah, interesting. Very interesting.
And it has to be, right? Because I don't know that they're stuck and failing to evolve. It's almost like they're degrading themselves and becoming corrupt.
But again, why? Because they have an idea about something. They have an idea about a way that something is or should be, and they keep reverting to that idea. They keep defaulting. They keep worshiping that idea. It always goes back to the idea that they have, and the idea is not the reality.
Okay, I might say it might also have to do with the failure to achieve an ideal, and then the compromises and the rationalization and the hypocrisy that enters in from having failed.
But then,
right. So you take, right. So to take Middle Tree, for example, and your goals and objectives, and then the reality that confronts those efforts. I don't know. Maybe, yeah. I think Dan.
Dan waved and disappeared into the.
Hopefully not indifferent or upset with the conversation, but he did mention that he had a hard stop, which is why I brought him back in. So, yeah, I think this is a topic to be explored further, and maybe to put it in different terms. Conservative versus progressive, not in a political sense, but those are multifaceted terms. But in this context, the conservative seeking to conserve and preserve what exists and what has been accomplished, and the progressive seeking to introduce change and modifications. And there's some kind of yin-yang balance there is all I'm getting at.
Oh, there absolutely is. I'm just, as usual, and I'm a broken record about it. It to me always goes back to the idea that we hold about the thing, whatever that thing is, rather than saying, because when you talk about failure, or when you talk about, what our own ideals actually are, that always goes back to a concept that we have about something, frequently a concept that has been unexplored by us as individuals. That's been implanted there. That's something that we need to flesh out, that we don't do in a way that services ourselves to the fullest extent. So,
well, I'm going to cut to our last commercial break now, and when we come back, we'll spend a couple of minutes looking at the fascinating chat. I think you accomplished tonight what you have philosophized about, in that there's been an ongoing chat that originated in the first section of the program, and regardless of what we've been talking about, you generated interest with that first segment that has been ongoing as those in the chat have been continuing to explore some of those concepts and further evolve them. This particular commercial break is about an anthology about perhaps what some of the biggest ideas and concepts are that have preoccupied or occupied humanity throughout human existence. When we come back, we'll look at some of the audience comments and wrap up with philosopher, author, founder of Middle Tree, educator, Joe Atman. Stay tuned.
The concept of heaven and hell has been a central idea throughout human thought and cultural history. From ancient civilizations to modern religions, people have explored the nature of the afterlife and the potential consequences of their actions during their lifetime. Royal Falcon Press Imprint presents a new project seeking diverse perspectives on the fundamental human theme of heaven and hell. Our goal is to create an anthology that provides readers with a rich and nuanced exploration of heaven and hell throughout human history, inviting writers to draw from a wide range of sources and authors, including religious texts such as the Bible and the Quran, philosophical treatises like Plato's Republic, and modern works like Neil Gaiman's The Sandman series, or Michelle Baum's The 5 People You Meet in Heaven. Scan the QR code to submit your contribution to Heaven and Hell at soupllc.com.
Welcome back, everyone. We're wrapping up our evening with Joe Atman, and we're going to look at some of the audience comments. There's been a fascinating discussion going on. I don't know if you've had a chance to look at any of them, Joe, or if you'd like me to just call out a few here.
I'm as I kind of said before, I always forget that I'm always in full screen. And so I shrunk the screen down and started to look. There are a lot of comments here. So yeah, wherever you want to go. I mean, there's plenty to respond to.
So I'm gonna go way back, and this particular commenter, we shared one before. I'm just gonna call her Layla, because there are 4s that I think function as A's in terms of trying to pronounce the the person's tagline here. So I'll just throw this one out there, which is more of a question that was an origination point of this long ongoing dialogue. But I think it gets to the core of some of the concepts that you talk about in your book. So where or what would you say is the threshold between discernment and observation?
That's a really, really good question. I think that discernment, and I think this is really the trick of it, is you have to understand where your own biases, where your own experiences are interfering with the observation. However, it's very simple to just observe, to just see, to just look at something. The difficult part then becomes in your digestion of that. It's the simplest thing in the world to just observe. The trick then becomes, how do you take that observation and what do you do with it? So there's no discernment, there's no, the threshold there. I understand the question, but to break it up simply is, observation is simple. That discernment of what is or what isn't, or what that observation actually is, that comes through the digestion, the processing of. But you can be with something quite easily. It's we who extract ourselves from that observation by saying, yeah, this is me, Joe Atman, talking to Wade. This is me as a person who has had these experiences sitting in this room and listen, that is all valid. That's all a part of our individual stories. But to purely and truly observe something, and again, it's the simplest thing in the world to do. We do it at every instance. It's the processing that then gets muddied. And then if we take something that was just a pure observation and put it into an interpretation, or couch it, have it as an interpretation. And that's where our constructs about the world come into play,
So,
and muddy that observation.
so would you, oh,
I hope I answered the question. I think I understood it.
well, I had a,
I never want to say I understand, but like,
so what comes to mind for me at this moment is quantum physics, right? Because there you have this thing about observation, and is it a particle or is it a wave, and the collapse of the wave function and the quantum entanglement of the spin of the particles, right? Is that us imposing our interpretation that when we observe something, we then observe its spin? And does that depend on the spin in that sense that we bring to a thing, right? Our interpretation that we're putting on it is our own spin. And is it helpful or hurtful to come at it with an awareness of what our bias is? Because to think that we don't have a bias is delusional, in my opinion. I don't think we human beings are capable of removing all bias. It might be a goal, an aspiration, but I think if you say, well, I'm not going to approach this in a biased manner, it's like an onion that you keep peeling the layers off, but you never fully get to the bottom of.
Then you have to question, where do your bias come from? Right? Like, and bias about what, right? It seems to me, and I'm just kind of digesting this myself as I'm listening to you talk about it. It seems to me that our bias likely come from societal interactions frequently. Like, if we were just living out in nature, if I was just a hermit out in the world, what kind of bias would I have? Would I have a affinity towards a ponderosa pine rather than a sugar pine? Would I like bears better than I like robins? Are those really bias? I mean, I guess they are in a certain way. So what kind
I
of
think
bias
you would have a bias that you're going to have to eat food to survive. That's going to form certain biases in how you approach that experience of being alone out in the wilderness.
Yeah, but and that's where I'm saying, like, and again, this is the maddening thing about thought itself, is because it never ends, and you constantly, especially in philosophy, you're taught always to question and always to define your terms, and then the extraordinarily frustrating and aggravating thing is you frequently never arrive on a definition, right? Because people have different interpretations, and that's the beauty of it, but also the frustrating thing when you're trying to conversate about it. So, because when I think of a bias, I think of something that, and again, I'm just digesting this here and now, but I think of something that is, given to us based on the way that we interact and engage with the world that is constructed by humanity. The bias I think that you're talking about is yeah, you have a preference to continue to survive. Is that the same kind of bias that we're talking about when we're trying to just observe something for what it is? And then, so just to evolve this conversation, when you're talking about the spin of particles in quantum mechanics and whatnot, I would say to you that, and what you asked about, are we observing the spin? Is our own spin on it the making the spin or something? It's along those lines. I'm saying it more cutesy, but I think your point is are we making that happening spin by our own observation of it, right? I mean, that's
well.
that's
So let me put it in a little bit more objective manner. Mm-hmm. And I'm not up on the very latest, but the foundation of some of this is that when the experiment was designed, when the hypothesis was, let's test and see if this particle is a particle.
This is the ghost particle experiment.
It presented itself as a particle. When the hypothesis was, let's see if this particle is a wave, it presented itself as a wave. And thus, I mean, that's whether that's really true or not, or whether there's a deeper level of something going on. My point is this: a scientific experiment in this sort of standard model of science is to form a hypothesis. And a hypothesis is at some level an expression of some sort of bias.
Yeah, if you're
Whether
again,
you
I would
know,
have to think
why
about
do you
that.
why do you care about this? Why are you choosing to observe this particular thing? Why are you spending the time to conduct an
Fair.
experiment of this nature? And how are you approaching this experiment? Because you're either wanting to prove or disprove something, and there are all kinds of biases inherent in that. And it may be the most neutral, natural, wonderful, joyful thing, but it's still by definition a bias. We hear the term bias and we view it as negative.
Yeah, I would. That's really interesting, Wade. Like, what? Like, why are you even here doing that experiment, right? Why? I mean, you must have something that's led you to that point,
You have
right?
some kind
That's
of
a really
bias,
interesting.
right? You're
Yeah,
leaning left or you're leaning right. You're leaning forward, you're leaning back as you do the experiment for some reason.
yeah.
Which
That's
you're
probably more perspective, right? Than, yeah. But and this is where I would again kind of say, well, everything is about our relationship to the world, and everything that we do is about the interpretation of that relationship. That relationship is always changing, and there's no set happening, and then the observer per se. Everything is changing given that the relationship continues to evolve.
yeah, I think
There's our boy Cameron.
this comment gets to that, right? Beingness is being co-created by everyone and everything. Maybe he meant to say in the universe. Planets are having the experience of being a planet as much as we are of being human. Um, and I do agree that everything is relationship. Again, in physics, the particles attract, they form electrons and protons and neutrons and atoms and then molecules, right? And then somehow mass and somehow gravity gets created, which we don't fully understand. But everything is in a relationship to everything.
So I'll leave you with this thought, or at least bring this to this particular comment by our boy Cameron. And what's up, Cameron? By the way, um, you can't have a thing without the opposite of that thing being in existence. You can't have Dallas, Texas without Chicago, Illinois. Chicago, Illinois allows Dallas, Texas to be Dallas, Texas, given that what is not Dallas, Texas is also inherent in Chicago, Illinois, and vice versa. The two exist to co-create one another. And in that yin and yang happening that you're talking about,
Darkness and light, right? Darkness is the absence of light
yeah, and you
by
can't
definition.
you literally can't have one thing without the other. And so Chicago, Illinois needs to exist. I mean, not Chicago itself, but that which is not, you know, the thing, Dallas, Chicago, whatever, exists in the thing, because if it didn't, that thing could not exist in and of itself, right? It's the exact yin and yang happening with the dark with the white, spot within it, and vice versa. So everything that is that we see as something other than whatever it is that we're observing forms to compose and make that thing that we are observing what it is. Everything that stands against that thing allows that thing to be what it is, and vice versa.
Fascinating. Well, we're gonna have to go and explore your bias in asking you to pick one of these comments as
Okay.
the recipient of tonight's free book.
Oh my gosh, there's so much.
I know it's here's a comment from one of those engaged in the conversation, which is actually touching on where now space is defined by its lack of physical occupants, right? Which is kind of what we were saying about darkness and
Yeah.
light. And
It
some of
couldn't
this
be space without that which was not space, right?
Yep. So I'll just let you take a moment and go through them here. So just ignore me while I talk, and see if you can find something there that's worthy of your bias at this moment to say, let's give that person a book.
Okay.
I think there's some interesting discussion here about differences of opinion and voting, right? And if all voices are allowed or heard, or some are excluded.
Yeah, there's, I mean, again, there's just so much, and given that I wasn't following all of them the whole time, um, there was one. I mean, I can just pick one. There was one about.
Here's one I like. I'm a firm believer that it's important to know the perspectives of as many people as you can to get a good look at the bigger picture.
Certainly, and I mean that's what the point of education is to make sure that we understand all of these other filters and these other perspectives. And what I'm saying is you have to kind of use that like soap, right? You wash yourself with the soap, but then you got to wash the soap off, right? And then you got to stand clean and just as yourself after digesting all of that. And come to whatever interpretations you want and need in order to again have that relationship with the world in the way that serves you and it best.
But I think part of the reason though for this is that if you have an extreme bias, you're not going to even consider those multiple perspectives. And there may be something that you really need to be almost confronted with, right? In order for you to, what you said very early on, realize what you think.
Yeah. I like AE 92's, we may never eliminate bias, but we can limit personal bias. Because that's kind of what we're talking about, right? The essence of it will always be observing through the lens of the human experience. And that really encapsulates a lot of what we've been discussing here. And so, and there's no way to get away from the human experience per se, except for that. What happens or what is it? I mean, you can ask yourself the question: when you see the thing, who's doing the seeing? Is it that's an old Buddhist saying is when you observe, who is it that makes the observation? And so in that sense, you could say that you are just participating in the act of observation itself. Then again, as a human being with, and when frequently we're talking about observation, we frequently default in our minds because we have a concept about what observation is, right? That might not necessarily be the whole picture. And this is a great point of what concepts are. A great example of that is that when we talk about observation, we're frequently talking about what we can see, feel, smell, hear, touch, right? That's not necessarily always just what observation is necessarily limited to, and yet we frequently default to our physical limitations in that regard, which are very limited. And that's a whole other discussion and a whole other podcast, but we have to be aware that that's not necessarily all that there is to observation and to that being with a thing.
Awesome. I didn't want to ignore Goodman Brown, who's had a number of interesting comments as well. This one here: personal bias might just be food for the ego, which is a sophisticated survival tool.
Absolutely.
And you might then ask, well, what kind of survival? How healthy is that survival? How kind of longevity of that survival? But it's an interesting perspective for sure.
Yeah.
So.
Great questions in this. I wish we could just talk about every question in here. I know we cannot. I'm just saying.
Well, we will absolutely have you back. But for now, one last task, one last accomplishment is to pick one of these. Joe, it's on you.
Yeah, I'm going to go with AE 92's comment there that I said. Even though, I mean, they're all sorts. Goodman Brown, Layla.
Absolutely.
I just saw that one and it was like,
totally respect it. And this isn't the one you're talking about, but I like this. Thus, we are biased towards communicable human impressions as we are indoctrinated to intelligent thought in certain patterns.
There it is.
Lots of interesting guys. Okay, so AE 92, you must reach out to us at info@soupllc.com. There it is in the chat, and I'll show it here on the screen. For AE 92, Still there, not listening to us, which is fine. still chatting in the chat. But AE92, do send us an email to info@soupllc.com, and you will be receiving a copy of A Philosophical War in the mail from the sponsors of our show. And he's excited right now. So there you go. A very worthy a very
For
worthy
sure.
recipient.
I hope
So
you enjoy it.
next week, for those of you who are still here, and for those who are going to catch this later, we will be having another guest back, John Christie, who is the director of a movie which he himself was in. I think it's called My Week as an Atheist, where he is a Christian theologian who went and encamped with some of the I don't know that they were militant atheists is the right word, but some of those people who were, very much trying to convert him to give up his belief in God. And John has some very interesting perspectives along similar lines coming out of that. He did take away a lot of questioning of what he did believe. He did submit himself to that with sincerity, in which he began to realize what he did think. And when we have John Christie back next week, for those of you who weren't here the first time, you'll get to learn what the outcome of that is, what he thinks and feels now, and what he learned from that journey. So same time, same place, 8:00 Central Time is when we go live. And next week we'll be here with John Christie. So thanks to everyone who was here tonight and participated. Thank you to you, Joe. Any final words of wisdom as we close tonight's show?
At last I get to try and say something wisdomous. Really only that, again, it's our concepts that are always going to hold us back in whatever we do. If we can observe in a pure form and way, that's the surest and truest way to having that relationship with reality that will bring us that peace that so many of us seek. And if you can figure out how to do that, please let me know.
Thanks, Joe. And my final comment here is that it did come back to me that the subtext of this show, the role of religion in society, is being changed, maybe not next week, but in the near future, to intellectually coherent discussions on spiritual commitment. Created in the image of God, intellectually coherent discussions on spiritual commitment. We welcome you back to this show as we evolve and as we grow through the experiences and through the guests that we have on the show, guests like Joe Atman. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you again for collaborating with us, working with us, and helping us to challenge our concepts and explore the relationships in that context.
Thanks, Wade.
See you all back here next week. Bye now.